On Boxing Day 2015, that's St. Stephen's Day for viewers throughout much of Europe, and the day after Christmas for Americans, Stoke City beat Manchester United 2-0 at the Britannia Stadium. What would ordinarily be considered a major giant killing raised significantly fewer eyebrows at the time. Manchester United were in dreadful form, meanwhile Stoke had made their home ground a fortress. Chelsea and Man City had both lost there in the last couple of months alone, and victory for Mark Hughes' side moved the Potters to within 3 points of their visitors. 2 days later, Stoke went and won 4-3 away at Everton. Stoke's 6 goals in 2 days against Man United and Everton was scored by 3 Champions League winners in Bojan, Marko Arnautovic, and Xherdan Shaqiri, plus Joselu, who now plays for Real Madrid. For the 3rd successive season, Stoke finished the campaign in 9th, sandwiched nicely in between Liverpool and Chelsea. The Potters had established themselves as almost the textbook definition of an established Premier League club, just as they had dreamt of when they won promotion back to the top flight of English football for the first time in over 20 years in 2008. Since then, Stoke have had 1 relegation, 6 different managers, and 5 successive finishes in the bottom half of the Championship table. Now the Potters sit 21st in the second tier of English football, with just 1 win from their last 8 league games, and they look to be at serious risk of relegation. You might, quite reasonably at this point, be questioning how even that disastrous fall from grace could possibly merit Stoke City the title of being the most cursed football club in England. After all, several teams have gone to the wall in recent years. Scunthorpe and Southend United almost followed in their footsteps last month alone, and even in the Championship, as I covered in a recent video, surely Sheffield Wednesday, who are yet to win a game this season, are in a more dire predicament than Stoke. Well, yes, and yes. All are in far worse predicaments, but they're also in relatively easily understandable crises. Stoke City, on the other hand, well, they have all of the ingredients for success. The Potters have super wealthy, local and passionate owners. They are almost an hour away from any other team in the top 2 tiers of English football, and they have spent an absolute fortune in recent years. And yet, Stoke just seem to get progressively worse, culminating in their current and, as yet, deepest malaise in decades. It doesn't seem to matter how managers or players perform elsewhere, as soon as they touch down in Staffordshire and come into contact with a Stoke City shirt, they crumble. Michael O'Neill took Northern Ireland to their first ever Euros, but couldn't guide Stoke City into the top half of the Championship table. Dwight Gale had scored 46 goals in his last 71 Championship appearances before joining Stoke, but has struck just 3 times in 39 appearances for the Potters. Heck, Eric Maxim Choupo-Moting only managed 5 goals in 30 games at the Bet365 Stadium, and his 2 clubs since then have been Paris Saint-Germain and Bayern Munich. It is for that reason that I was recently asked whether Stoke City might be the most cursed football club in all of English football. A cake that is baked with all of the right ingredients, but still comes out tasting like So in today's video, we're going to investigate whether Stoke City really are just the unluckiest team in English football, or whether there is an underlying cause and something deeper afoot going on at the oldest and richest club in the Championship. A lot of people probably don't realise just how rich Stoke City's owners are. Peter Coates first became the majority shareholder at Stoke City in 1986, 12 years after founding a successful chain of bookmakers. Coates oversaw Stoke's move from the Victoria Ground to the Britannia Stadium and enjoyed success with former Scottish international Lou Macari at the helm, but Stoke's first season at their new ground was an absolute disaster. Macari was sacked and filed a lawsuit against Coates for wrongful dismissal. Meanwhile, Stoke were relegated to the 3rd tier of English football. Following a 7-0 defeat against Birmingham City in January 1998, Coates was forced to resign as chairman, and in 1999, he sold the club to an Icelandic consortium led by Gunnar Gislason. Gislason became the youngest chairman in the Football League, following the £3.5 million acquisition, aged only 38. And in 2002, Stoke returned to what is now the Championship, following a successful playoff campaign. In 2006, though, Coates bought Stoke back for a fee of just £1.7 million, reappointing himself as chairman and bringing the recently dismissed Tony Pulis back as the club's manager. The Peter Coates that sold Stoke in 1999 and the Peter Coates that bought the club back in 2006 were very different men though, at least in terms of the resources they were able to command. Coates was already a wealthy man during the 1990s, but by 2006, his family squatted over a global gambling empire. At the turn of the millennium, the family founded Bet365, led by Peter's daughter Denise, and in 2005, the betting chain that Peter had built up was sold to repay loans and to help build up the online business. As early movers in the online gambling industry, Bet365 enjoyed rapid growth. By 2006, almost £1 billion was already being wagered on the website annually, and by the time Stoke won promotion to the Premier League in 2008, that had more than doubled to £2 billion, and then by 2010, it was over £5 billion. Now, Bet365 is reported to be the world's largest online bookmaker. Denise Coates, the company's largest shareholder, is one of the highest paid executives on the planet and has topped the UK earning charts for a number of years. In 2020, Denise was paid a salary of £422 million and dividends of £48 million. Last year, in light of lower profits due to an aggressive expansion into the US market, following local deregulation, Coates was only paid a mere £213.4 million in salary, as well as being entitled to over £100 million in dividends. Hey, look, times are tough, everyone's making cutbacks. The Coates family as a whole, who owns Stoke through a subsidiary of Bet365, are estimated to be worth close to $10 billion. That's more than any other majority shareholder in the Championship, by some distance, and most Premier League owners, including those at Tottenham Hotspur and Manchester United. In fact, the only clubs with majority shareholders who are clearly wealthier than the Coates family throughout the entirety of the English Football League pyramid are Newcastle United and Manchester City. When Peter Coates returned in 2006, he claimed the Icelandic consortium had left Stoke in a mess and more than £9 million in debt. Neither Coates nor Pulis were particularly popular returnees at the time, but together they offloaded a lot of the foreign players brought in by the previous regime, replacing them with experienced Championship and Premier League players like Danny Higginbottom, Ricardo Fuller, and Liam Lawrence. Stoke almost made the playoffs that season, having finished 13th the previous term, and in the 2007-08 campaign, they sealed a long-awaited return to the top table of English football. In the Premier League, Stoke forged a reputation for playing direct football with a big physical group of players. It was a characterisation that Stoke and Pulis didn't always feel was wholly fair, but they embraced the fear that teams had about a trip to the Britannia and made sure to play to their strengths. The January arrival of James Beattie all but guaranteed Stoke's survival in that debut campaign, and for the next 8 years, they never really looked like going down. Pulis took Stoke to an FA Cup final in 2011 and European football the following season, where the Potters reached the knockout stage of the Europa League before succumbing to defeat against Valencia in the round of 32. When Pulis left Stoke in 2013, he was replaced by fellow Welshman Mark Hughes, who sought to take the shackles off the uber-disciplined squad that Pulis had assembled while sprinkling it with a touch of flair and invention. In his first season, Hughes signed Marko Arnautovic. In his second, he welcomed Bojan, and in his third, it was the turn of Xherdan Shaqiri. To some people's surprise, the transition was an immediate one. Stoke finished 9th in Hughes' debut campaign, their highest league finish of the Premier League era, and they replicated that in the 2 seasons that followed. A League Cup semi-final defeat against Liverpool in January 2016, just a month after the Manchester United win that I mentioned right at the start of this video, is often cited as a turning point for Stoke. It's interesting because, whilst Liverpool are obviously giants of not just the English but the European game, they only finished one place above Stoke that season, and the Coates family have an almost identical estimated net worth to Liverpool owner John W. Henry. There was virtually nothing to split the two teams over two legs, as Liverpool ended up winning the tie 6-5 on penalties. Stoke still finished 9th that season, but as I covered in a recent video, there seems to be such a thing as the 9th place curse in the Premier League, whereby every team that finishes there is doomed to be imminently relegated or worse. Well, Stoke finished 9th 3 times, which is perhaps why they appear to be the most cursed club in all of England, and have still not yet broken that spell. The reason for the supposed curse is because 9th is a position, often occupied by a team that has reached their ceiling, is prone to being stripped of their manager or best players, and due to the structural disadvantages in terms of breaking into that rich 6 or 7, face an almost inevitable decline. That is a pretty good short summation of what happened at Stoke. By the summer of 2016, there was already a sense in which Stoke, despite their impressive league finish, had begun to go stale, and some sources close to the club have since claimed that Mark Hughes felt that he had taken the club as far as he could. Stoke still finished 13th, but they had a really sluggish end to the 2016-17 season, winning just 2 of their last 11 games. That was likely in part because survival had already been guaranteed, and they had nothing to play for. But that sluggishness continued at the start of the following season, and Stoke would very swiftly find themselves with an awful lot to play for. Whilst at first Hughes had been able to marry the resilience and spirit harboured by Pulis with the spark and creativity of some of his enigmatic new arrivals, in the summer of 2017, a lot of that resilience and spirit was lost, and some of their replacements were sorely lacking in that department. Jonathan Walters, Glenn Whelan and Phil Bardsley were all big characters who departed, in addition to Stoke's star man Marko Arnautovic, who forced through a move to West Ham. Stoke's arrivals, meanwhile, were probably best summed up by the loan signing of Jesse Rodriguez. Not entirely dissimilar to Bojan, Arnautovic, and Shaqiri, Jesse was someone who was once very, very highly rated at a young age, but whose career had stalled, therefore putting him within Stoke's reach. As with those three, Hughes felt Jesse was a real coup for Stoke, and that he could get the best out of him. Jesse twice made more than 30 appearances in UEFA Champions League winning campaigns at Real Madrid as a youngster, and had joined PSG only the previous summer with an anti-Barcelona clause written into his contract for €25 million. Hughes' belief that he could get the best out of Jesse proved to be unfounded, and that is putting things in the nicest possible terms. Following stints in Madrid and Paris, Jesse's partner apparently didn't fancy relocating to Stoke. She subsequently sued Jesse for neglect, who countersued her for slander and harassment, demanding that she be sentenced to 3 to 5 years in prison. They later got back together. Jesse seemed intent on living the life of a superstar footballer without actually doing any of the football bit during his time in Stoke. Not only was Jesse useless when he played, he was also entirely disinterested. And as Stoke became embroiled in a bitter relegation dogfight, he decided to go AWOL. Jesse wasn't the sole reason for Stoke's downfall by any means, or even the worst signing that summer, at least in financial terms. That title would have to go to Kevin Wimmer, a man who was signed by Tottenham for £4.3 million in 2015, and then somehow sold to Stoke City for a massive £18 million 2 years later, despite only having made a grand total of 15 Premier League appearances during that time, and just 5 the previous season. Wimmer ended up costing Stoke exactly £18 million for every clean sheet that he kept at the club. Factor in his wages and, pound for pound, he must go down as one of the worst signings of all time, and I don't just mean at Stoke. Wimmer just wasn't good enough though. Jesse might not have been as bad a signing, since it was a loan, but he epitomised the cacophony of disinterested, financially motivated clowns and cretins that Hughes had assembled heading into his final season in Staffordshire. In January 2018, Hughes was sacked. In truth, Coates ought to have pulled the trigger much sooner. It's understandable that Hughes had a lot of credit in the bank following 3 successive 9th place finishes and an almost as comfortable spot in 13th, but Coates waited until Stoke were already into the bottom 3 over halfway through the season before finally deciding to act. A month earlier, in response to calls by Stoke fans for Hughes to be sacked, Coates stated that he didn't know what all of the fuss was about. In a revealing interview, Coates appeared to intimate that because Stoke had survived the previous season, despite not playing very well, he remained optimistic that they could do the same this time around. It spoke to a combination of both complacency and a lack of ambition in the eyes of many Stoke City supporters, not to mention leaving Coates with egg on his face when he was forced to sack Hughes so soon after giving that interview, in which he dismissed the Hughes-out contingent of Stoke's fans. Hughes' replacement also perhaps pointed to a lack of ambition. After Quique Sanchez-Flores turned down a contract due to a hefty relegation clause, and Gary Rowett decided to remain at Derby County, Stoke appointed Paul Lambert, a man whose last 2 jobs had been in the Championship. In the January window, Stoke signed Konstantinos Staffelidis on loan from Augsburg, Moritz Bauer for £5.5 million from Rubin Kazan, and marquee signing Badouin Dai, who arrived for a fee of £14 million from Galatasaray. Stoke needed players who were up for the fight and who could make an immediate impact, but none of their arrivals had played in English football before. Crucially, they also failed to bring in a centre-forward. Following the summer sale of Marko Arnautovic to West Ham, Stoke suffered from a dire lack of goals. Saido Berahino, signed 12 months earlier for a potential £15 million from West Brom, was still yet to find the back of the net at Stoke. Hesse was, well, probably somewhere in Gran Canaria. Mam Biramju found himself playing as a wing-back, and Peter Crouch had just turned 37 years old. Xherdan Shaqiri ended up being Stoke's highest scorer that season with just 8 goals, only one of which actually came in a match that Stoke won. It was little wonder that Stoke were relegated at the end of the season then, bringing the curtain down on a decade of Premier League football. To make matters even worse, Coates was very nearly right. Despite being woeful almost all season, as they had been for much of the preceding 18 months, Stoke very nearly stayed up. Just 3 points separated them from Southampton in 17th, and a half-decent centre-forward in January almost certainly would have kept them up. Relegation can happen to any club outside of what was then the Premier League's Rich 6 and is now the Rich 7 though, even if it was eminently avoidable for Stoke. The real question would be how they responded to that setback. One thing that the Coates family can never be accused of is a lack of investment in Stoke City. During the club's decade in the top flight, Stoke spent more than £250 million. Their net spend of over £180 million was the 6th highest in the division throughout that time, above Tottenham, Leicester and Everton, and only very narrowly trailing Arsenal and Liverpool. Stoke's wage bill was also considerable. In the year that the club went down, it was the 13th highest in the Premier League at £94 million, accounting for 74% of Stoke's total turnover. Even with the Premier League's enormous television rights revenue coming in, Stoke still lost £30 million the season that they went down. Championship football then, even with the benefit of parachute payments, was sure to provide a shock to the system, but the Coates family didn't scale back their investment. In fact, they went the opposite way. The 2018-19 season ended up being Stoke's highest spending campaign ever, as they forked out over £50 million in a single season. Even taking player sales into account, Stoke's net spend still totaled almost £30 million, which was close to double the Championship's next highest spenders, while retaining by far the highest wage bill in the division. Stoke's strategy was effectively to do a Newcastle, so to speak, who when relegated in 2009 and 2016 refrained from holding fire sales but held on to their best players for a single season, cruised to the Championship title and immediately regained Premier League revenue. It was a strategy which appeared to be not without logic at the time, and Stoke were installed as strong favourites both to win promotion and the Championship title that season. Even the most cursory of glances at their squad that season would have led any football fan to suspect that that was the most likely outcome. After much consideration, Stoke decided to part company with Lambert and instead appoint Gary Rowett, who had been one of their two preferred candidates when Hughes left the previous season. The season didn't quite start as most people had expected though, and tragedy turned to farce in January when Rowett was sacked and replaced by Nathan Jones. Stoke was sold on the work that Jones had done at Luton, taking them from League 2 to the brink of the Championship, but his time in Staffordshire was bizarre. In his first press conference, Jones talked about the possibility of one day managing Barcelona. The Welshman's strangeness, since played out on a national stage at Southampton, bemused most of Stoke's players. Jones might have been able to nurture his own weird and wonderful world at Luton, with a tight-knit squad containing several former non-league players who all bought into his ideas, but with a sprawling squad of ex-Premier League players and current internationals, he looked woefully out of his depth. Speak to almost anyone inside Stoke at the time, and they'll tell you they were bemused at the fact that Jones had enjoyed any success anywhere. The Potters finished 16th, and the following season, they endured the joint worst ever start to a championship season before Jones was finally dismissed. He was replaced by Michael O'Neill, who had done an outstanding job with Northern Ireland. O'Neill managed to steady the ship and keep Stoke in the Championship, but this was a squad of players, Jack Butland, Joe Allen, Benik Afobe, Bruno Martins-Indi, that was still expected to compete at the top end of the division. O'Neill stuck it out for almost 3 years, which is equivalent to about 400 years in recent Stoke City managerial lifetimes, but having failed to deliver that vision, he was sacked following a poor start last season. During O'Neill's time at the helm, Stoke faced significant financial difficulties, not because of the Coates', but because of the EFL's financial fair play rules, particularly once they lost parachute payments in the 2021-22 season. The doing a Newcastle strategy works fine, assuming that, like Newcastle, you immediately win promotion, thus offsetting your single season of enormous losses with the return of Premier League income. If you don't get promoted, as was the case with Stoke, you're just left with the massive losses part, piling up, and over a few years, that is enough to land you in serious regulatory trouble. Stoke pulled several financial levers to avoid being hit with serious sanctions, which included offloading several high earners, but most notably, they sold their stadium and training ground to a subsidiary of Bet365 for more than £75 and £15 million respectively. You would have thought, at the point at which a subsidiary of a bookmaker's is buying a football stadium and training ground from a club they own, some serious questions might be asked about the way in which English football is governed. No, apparently not. Stoke now lease their stadium and training ground back, from their owners, for £4.7 million a season. The Coates family further relieved the burden on the club by writing off a £120 million debt owed to them by the club and converting a further £40 million of debt into equity. Up to that point, Stoke had by far the most debt in the Championship, over £200 million, and they have received the second most owner financing of any team in the Championship over the last 10 years, trailing only QPR. The relief of that debt leaves Stoke with only a £92 million debt to Bet365 remaining, and zero external debt. Nonetheless, Stoke continue to hemorrhage cash. A total of £39 million in the club's last set of accounts, to be precise, without owner funding. In recent years, Peter's son and co-chairman John Coates has become the main man at the club, not to the particular delight, it should be said, of most Stoke City fans. Denise Coates, who took the family business online and pioneered its remarkable growth, is reported to be relatively disinterested in football, a bit like Jesse Rodriguez. John Coates, meanwhile, like Peter, is a lifelong Stoke City fan, but perhaps not the wiliest of football operators. Though former managing director Tony Scholes, who was also heavily criticised, spent 17 years at the club, Stoke have never really had a modern director of football. The club is very old-fashioned in the sense that they give enormous amounts of control to the manager themselves, which, combined with a hefty salary and a healthy budget, still makes Stoke a very attractive proposition for managers. That was illustrated by how easily, last season, Stoke were able to poach one of the highest rated managers in the division, in the form of Alex Neil, away from Sunderland, a massive club by Championship standards, who were above Stoke in the table and had already beat them that season. Unfortunately, Stoke were operating an Alex Ferguson at Manchester United style manager-focused club structure, but with Chelsea-style managerial turnover. That is a recipe for disaster, and it means that with every, typically quite frequent, new appointment, the squad is ripped up and Stoke starts all over again. That is a very expensive, inefficient, and disruptive way of running a football club, or any business for that matter, and it is why most clubs are no longer run like that. At other clubs, you have the owners, who are often quite detached. Then you have a chief executive overseeing the club's business operations, a director of football, who is ultimately responsible for recruitment decisions and the footballing direction of the club, and often also a technical director, and a head of recruitment to assist in those roles. Peter, and now John Coates, have employed people in those or similar sounding roles over the years, but they have rarely actually called the shots. Stoke's current technical director, Ricky Martin, for example, not he of Livin' La Vida Loca fame, is a friend of Alex Neil's who worked alongside him at Norwich City, and it seems probable that if Neil were sacked tomorrow, Martin wouldn't be too far behind. And all of a sudden, Stoke are back at square one again. Stoke fans may hope, however, that head of recruitment Jared Dublin will be retained. Dublin is only 31 years old, and he joined Stoke after just 4 months at crisis-ridden Reading, but already his slightly more left-field arrivals like Andre Vidigal and Mehdi Leris have been among Stoke's best players. Following another chaotic summer though, Stoke are already down to the bare bones this season. In their most recent 2-0 defeat against Leicester City, just before the international break, Stoke's 7-man bench featured 2 goalkeepers and 2 16-year-olds in Sol Sidibe, son of Stoke City legend Mamadi Sidibe, and Jayden Dixon. It is important to note that, for all of their faults, and they are considerable, as I have outlined, it was the Coates family that took Stoke to the Premier League and kept the club there for a decade. And there are several positive aspects to their ownership as well. Stoke's season ticket prices, for example, have been frozen for the last 15 years, during which time inflation has risen by a massive 50%. Stoke have offered free coach travel to all away games since 2013, and the club recently submitted plans for a new £1.5 million fan zone, which is part of a much larger regeneration scheme. I interviewed Peter Coates a few years ago for a book that I wrote about Neil Franklin, and it was evident how deeply he cared about Stoke City and the passion that he had for the sport. Most fans would rightly be envious of Stoke for having super rich local owners who are actually fans of the club, but fandom isn't a substitute for expertise. Stoke may have all of the ingredients for success then, but the chef, John Coates in this instance, would appear to have no idea how to use them. The oven has a gas leak, and the cake has been allowed to go very stale. Stoke are stuck in the past with a leadership model that has been jettisoned by most clubs now, including all of the leading clubs, and for very good reason. For the Potters to progress, the Coates family need to put some distance between themselves and the senior management and hire capable executives, rather than handing out jobs for the boys. Then, and only then, are Stoke City likely to be able to move forward without suffering from such chronic short-termism, constant upheaval, and transfer mishaps. Ingiani Mbula, Kevin Vimmer, Badouin Dye, Saido Berahino, Benica Fobe, Tom Ince, Sam Vokes and Ryan Woods, Stoke have been among the most reckless and clueless clubs in terms of transfer activity in all of English football over the last 7 or 8 years. For a club with a settled and highly experienced ownership structure, with plenty of resources at their disposal, that is pretty much unforgivable. The trouble for Stoke City is that, in previous years, when they were still rubbish but had a squad laced with quality players who just weren't performing, they always had the potential to turn on the style here and there, and enough times to get them out of trouble. The Stoke squad is no longer among the most talented in the Championship though, following a raft of FFP-mandated cost-cutting measures and atrocious recruitment, nor is it even close. The blessing for Stoke, however, is that as bad as they have been this season, and they have been very bad, Sheffield Wednesday, Rotherham United and Queen's Park Rangers have all been considerably worse, and there is every chance that they will continue to be worse than them for the entirety of this season. That may very well give Stoke a temporary reprieve this season, but if they fail to get their own house in order, it will be just that. Stoke have effectively been on the decline, sometimes slowly, sometimes rapidly, for the last 8 years now, and goodwill alone from the club's owners will not arrest that slide. So no, surprisingly enough, Stoke City probably aren't actually cursed. They have just indiscriminately signed players and managers who succeeded elsewhere, with zero idea of what to do with them, and had no strategic leadership that has left them flailing around like a plastic bag in a storm. And if you have heard the wind howling or rain thundering in the background, that is Storm Babbitt trying to get her 5 minutes of fame on the world's finest YouTube channel. Some people would find that kind of thing irritating when trying to do their job, but not me. I just interpreted it as a closing metaphor for the chaos and confusion of Stoke City. There is a reason why this channel has been nominated for awards. Anyway, that is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for both this channel, HITC Sevens, and also my second channel, Alfie Potts Harmer, both of which should be on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username @HITC Sevens on all three, and all of those links, plus a whole lot more, should be down in the video description below. Cheers!